Good afternoon, and welcome to this wonderful session where we are going to have some of the most talented people in the food world with us. Ertharin Cousin, who is here with us this afternoon virtually from Oakland, California, and Professor Garrett Grady Lovelace, who is, of course, an associate professor in the School of International Service. I am Johanna Mendelsohn Foreman. I'm an adjunct professor at American University and a distinguished fellow at the Stimson Center. But there are lots of biographies of Ertharin Cousin on the web. She has a wonderful Wikipedia page, but I wanted to tell you that you are looking at one of the most powerful women, not only in America, but the world. And that's because throughout her career, she has mixed two very important things, food and politics. And no, students and who are listening, these are running in her veins and they are completely compatible. And that's why the power that she brings as a former ambassador, as a board member of one of the major corporations that manages the global food supply, Bayer, as a former entrepreneur, politics is in her veins. Some of you don't know that she was very active in the Democratic Party in the early 90s when they wooed her to Washington from her home in Chicago to become the deputy vice chair and to run events there. And I wanted to say that these skills that you learn along the way have empowered her not only as a woman, but also as a leader in the African American community and a leader in the global food community. And I just want to tell you one little thing. You see what happens when you have interesting stories on the web? I learned that you were an entrepreneur as a child, that you sold candy because your grandma had stores and you would go out in the summer. And that was the way you were able to buy ice cream. And I remember those days. I didn't have a grandma like that, but I did remember the ice cream man. So I was very thrilled to see that that spirit still remains. And I know that the conversation that you're going to have with us today is important, not only because we're celebrating International Women's Day, but also because you, as a figure at a time when the world is looking to global food supplies and the challenges we face, can enlighten us in the next hour. So thank you so much, Ertharin. Thank you, Garrett, for organizing this. And thank you for letting me just be a fly on the ceiling and listen.
Hopefully you're not a fly and just listening, Johanna. Hopefully you're joining too. So we're so honored to have Ertharin Cousin join us. Thank you so much for joining us virtually. We wish we could be hosting you in person at American University School of International Service, located in DC in traditional Piscataway lands. And we'd love to first just hear a little bit about your current position. Johanna, Dr. Mendelsohn Foreman was talking about the intersection of food and politics. I agree, it's the most important intersection out there. So I love that we've converged our interests in this extremely timely point. Right now, rates of hunger and malnourishment were already bad 3 years ago and have doubled internationally and domestically. So the urgency of how food access and food equity gets expanded is of such importance at all levels of governance, at all scales, at all communities and nation states. And right now with rising conflict and geopolitical insecurity, the question of food insecurity and hunger and outright famine is even all the more dire. So perhaps you could introduce yourself a little bit just in terms of where you are now, in terms of thinking through and leading work on this important issue.
Well, thank you for, first of all, to Dr. Johanna Mendelsohn Foreman. Johanna, my friend. What was obvious from that introduction is that she is not only a colleague and a cohort in the food security and nutrition community, but she's also what I like to call a good girlfriend. And we can't do this work without those. Garrett, thank you for bringing me into this dialogue with you today. And hopefully we can through a robust exchange of ideas, enlighten students about the status of the challenges that we're facing in the global community today, as well as here at home, domestically regarding food security. I think that too often we think about food insecurity as over there, as opposed to what too many Americans are facing right here at home. So what am I doing now? I finished my time at my term at the World Food Program in 2017. I was then invited to Stanford University, where I served as a distinguished fellow in the Freeman Spogli Institute and the Center for Food Security and Environment for several years, and I actually taught out there. I still serve as a visiting scholar at Stanford, which gives me the opportunity to continuously explore the issues with students and the way they're thinking about these issues and the answers to addressing these challenges. I also serve as a distinguished fellow for the Chicago Council on Global Affairs, where we will host a conversation this Thursday with Ivo Dodler talking about the Ukraine and the human rights challenges, or the humanitarian challenges of, as well as human rights challenges of the action in the Ukraine today. My passion project that I started when I was at Stanford with support from the Rockefeller Foundation and BCG is I've now stood up and serve as CEO and managing director of a new organization called Food Systems for the Future. And what we are working to do is to develop the market businesses, both domestically and internationally, that can support access to more nutritious food for underserved populations, and also create an opportunity for us to scale businesses. And we can talk as we go through this conversation about how we address the challenges of food insecurity, not just through charity, but through market systems that work for everyone, and not just the affluent, whether we're talking affluent consumers, affluent or affluent farmers. We need to ensure that everyone has affordable access to a balanced, nutritious diet.
Exactly. So important. So I guess thinking through the ongoing crisis that we're in terms of lack of affordable, nutritious food for so many people in the world, many activists and scholars and community leaders have been thinking about the right to food as a framework. And the right to food seems obvious, but it's actually really hard to think through how that would be operationalized. Do you just argue that heads of state need to be the ones who are held accountable? Is it the private sector? Obviously, you bring up this question of businesses, and there's such an important role for people making a livelihood, growing food and selling food, as well as having there be affordable food. And yet the current political economy is very consolidated. There's just a few companies that control so much of the food sector. So even just thinking through, are they accountable if there's a broader sense of injustice or lack of access to food? So within the right to food movement, there has been the special rapporteurs on the right to food at the UN special rapporteurs. And this got started a few years ago, and Olivier de Schutter, whom I know you've worked with, has been very prolific in writing about the right to food. Hillel Elver succeeded after him, and now we have Michael Fakhri. And I've been following their work, and I encourage everyone in the audience to look up the special rapporteurs on the right to food and their publications and their videos. One of their through lines is that actually the dominant trade model, the kind of neoliberal trade model, has actually undermined equitable access to food or even a good livelihood for farmers in various ways. And so there's this ongoing debate about, if we're really thinking about the right to food, does there need to be reforms or, really critical analysis of the dominant trade model? And so I just wanted to open it up to you to think through your engagement with Olivier de Schutter and Hillel Elver and now Michael Fakhri in thinking through this question of food sovereignty and the role of food sovereignty in food justice and food access.
There was a lot packed into that question there. Let me just tell you, okay? Let me see. Where do we start? First of all, the United States has never endorsed and ratified the right to food. And so when we're talking about the right to food, as we were talking before about rules over there versus rules here at home, we do not have a national food policy. We do not have a right to food in the United States. And so oftentimes when we are talking about this issue from an intellectual standpoint, as we are doing here today, we're talking about something over there that we can't even enforce here at home. And so I'm often challenged by a suggestion of what we demand of governments when we don't demand the same thing of our own government. So I'll start from that point. Secondly, as far as the right to food is concerned, the right to food, a right is only as good as your ability to claim it. And the responsibility for the right to food, first and foremost, belongs to government. And as does any right. and the ability for that government to protect and enforce the rights of its citizens. And so the ability of a government to support what is the right to access to adequate and affordable food, first of all, is based in a food justice requirement. And that means that we respect, protect, and fulfill that right. And so when we talk about a right to food, we need to ensure that we're not just talking about the right to access to a charitable food system, or the right to the right to food sovereignty alone, because if food sovereignty does not give to the citizens in that community, in that country, the access they need to affordable, nutritious food, then it is we are in violation by our attempts to protect. We're in violations of our responsibility to respect and to afford the just access to a right to nutritious food. And so particularly when we begin these very complex questions of the international food trade system versus the access of a local community to the right to food, I would say let's unpack what the challenges are. The first thing I would argue, and I think that anyone who is serious about ensuring access to food and not just theories around the food, is to ensure that we grow food where we can most effectively grow food. And if I am living in a marginal place, I may not have the capacity in that marginal place, the Sahel, for instance, to grow enough food to support the population living in that area. And so demanding food sovereignty in an area where the production capability of the land that is under agricultural production today, without continuing to expand, because that's another whole conversation about expanding agricultural lands, may not be the right answer. And trade instead is the right answer, because there are places in the world where you can grow the commodities that are necessary, but we should not have unfettered trade. We need trade with rules. Too often, what the debate that we're having over the system is not the challenge. It is how the system is operated that becomes the challenge. Ensuring that those who are part of any trading system, whether it is local, regional, or international, that they are receiving adequate economic return for their participation in that system is critical to the ensuring that those who are actors in the food system are receiving the support that they need, whether that food is provided through international trade or not. When we saw the 2007, 2008 food price hike spikes that resulted in riots in 40 cities across the world, it was not the fact that we had international trade, it was the fact that we had countries that created export bans that affected net importing countries' ability to access food. So the problem wasn't the trade, it was how we were using the international trading system to protect one group over another. One of the things that we saw in COVID, that we witnessed in COVID, was that we learned lessons from that food price spike that resulted in early days of COVID. We had a couple countries that erected trade embargoes, export embargoes, that were quickly rescinded. And as for the most part, the international trading, the food trading system operated as we needed it to operate throughout the COVID crisis. The challenge became regional trading systems, local trading systems, because what we found was that in developing countries where there was a lack of access to refrigeration, lack of access to storage, lack of access to appropriate transport for food products, we found grains in the market, but lack of access to produce, lack of access to poultry. Because when you had lockdowns, I'll give you a great example. In Senegal, for example, where you had a curfew, farmers were then required to travel during the day to bring produce into the market. What that meant was that because there are no refrigerated trucks, that they lost large quantities of produce before they could get it into the markets. They arrived there in the evenings when the markets are now, because of curfews, closed, and you lose even more produce when it has to sit overnight now. And then by the morning, you have higher prices for produce, making access to produce even less affordable for more people, because of not the international trading system, but because of the lack of logistic support for the regional and domestic trading system. And so those are challenges that are not about the system, but how we operate them and the rules behind how we operate those systems.
It's so important. All these issues and unpacking them is so key. The food sovereignty movement, which began in the Sahel. I mean, it's so interesting that, the Nyaleni Declaration, I encourage everyone to look up the 2007 Nyaleni Declaration on Food Sovereignty, emerged in Mali, in rural Mali, with all of these communities, many pastoralists, fisher folk, farmers, around the world, but particularly all throughout the Sahel and West Africa, converging to think through not against trade. So food sovereignty was never about ending trade. Trade is ancient, trade is human, trade is never going to stop. But the terms of the trade, as you were saying, and how right now, for the first time in history, for the last generation, from kind of WTO onward, many places in the world dependent upon imports for their basic grains, not just for lemons or for olive oil, but for their basic staple grains, and that is geopolitically risky. I mean, to some degree, there was, the problem of export bans is very disruptive, but there was huge bottlenecks of international trade. The Suez Canal was blocked, so there was actually many disruptions, and it showed how vulnerable and fragile these very centralized global supply chains were, when a multi-scalar set of supply chains and trades would have allowed for more resiliency and more, adaptivity in the face of climate crises, as well as the pandemic. So I think what's so compelling about the food sovereignty framework is that it is not anti-trade at all. It's a matter of reconceptualizing the movement of food and supply chain so that there's not a dependency upon an import for one staple grain, so that when that gets curtailed or when the price jumps or doubles like it did in 2007, all of a sudden people can't afford their basic, staples. And so what would it mean to reconceptualize agri-food systems so that the grains and the extraordinary agriculture of the Sahel, was revitalized rather than being further decimated for a more import dependency? So,
we're not disagreeing here, Gary.
Yeah, no, I know.
It is essential that we have diverse food systems.
Yeah.
I think that the suggestion that we're not going to rely upon international trade may be too strong of a statement. But what we need is an agility in our food system that allows us to, when the levers of politics or climate affect one food system, we have the capacity to access the benefits of another. And if we don't keep them all strong and productive, we do not have that option. And so that is too often when these conversations are engaged in, we talk about one versus the other. And what I argue is that we don't have the luxury, particularly during this time of climate crisis, for one over the other. We need to ensure that we have appropriate rules and systems in place to support, as you said, the historic trading nature of our societies and the agility that is necessary to ensure access to food at an affordable price, and that we are protecting the economic opportunity for all actors across the food system.
So building off that exact point about the economic actors, I study agricultural policy in the US and internationally. And I think what is so confounding and surprising to many people is how few farmers make a living from farming. Even in the US, which is the alleged winner, the median income from farming is below zero and has been since mid-90s when the WTO and the kind of broader neoliberal model began. So, people get money from subsidies, or from a check from the government or from the assets of the land or off-farm income. But this question of agrarian viability is so core to food security because so many, as you know, more than anyone else, working with the World Food Program and FAO, the majority of hungry people are actually farmers or rural people or campesinos. So the irony that they are the brilliant minds of agriculture and yet not able to use their land mass for their own or kind of regional, but are growing export commodity crops, but not getting a fair price for that export commodity crop, unless they can't cover their own cost of production and then are largely, in this kind of cycle of debt, which is what makes the Indian farmer uprising of 2020 and 2021 so compelling. It's the largest peaceful protest in human history. And it's farmers saying, you got to give us a fair price. Otherwise, we're going to be in a cycle of death and lose our land and be one of the hungry masses of Delhi or a big city. So I wanted to hear your thoughts on kind of agrarian viability and actually how few people are covering their cost of livelihood in the current agricultural model that's very export and commodity crop production oriented.
Well, yeah, again, lots of questions in there that we can unpack. We can spend the balance of this conversation just talking about exactly the statements that you've just made. And let me try to pull some pieces apart here. First of all, agree wholeheartedly that we need to ensure that we recognize that our farmers are business people and that the farmers deserve a fair price for the foods that they grow. Regardless of what they are growing. Today, as you have just so well articulated, the return that the farmer receives for their crop is too often far less than what that farmer needs to support their livelihoods. The challenge that we have in many of the communities that you've just described is that, again, it's back to that lack of access to storage, lack of access to refrigeration. And what we see far too often is farmers receiving a farm gate price for their food, for their yields, and selling into the market at the height of the market, because they can't hold anything back. I met with a woman farmer in Rwanda once who had bags of beans in her house. She had been able to purchase a concrete floor for her house. And what that allowed her to do was then she said, "This is my bank account." She was able to hold those beans until market prices were higher and then sell her beans into the market, giving her the financial resources that she needed for her children's school fees, for covering a new tin roof for her house, all the things we take for granted that these farmers who have no means for supporting their market access have the challenge of overcoming. And so when we think about farmers, we need to think about the entire system. We often talk about increasing farmer yields, but we don't talk about increasing farmer access to markets and productive markets that give them the ability to benefit from those increased yields. And so that is part of those of us who have performed this work for a very long time. Part of the challenges that we're now working to overcome is ensuring that farmers are included in the system in a way that will allow them to have more of a livelihood from what they grow. But that also is going to require that we have the kind of subsidies and insurance and other financial tools that support farmers' ability to capitalize on the wins as well as the losses. As you know, farming is one of the hardest, most difficult businesses that you can perform. And too often, without those subsidies and the other and insurance and other capital infusions that farmers receive, the ability for that farmer to make a living wage from their efforts without that support is impossible. And too often today, those kinds of financial infusions are unavailable to smallholder farmers, to less affluent farmers. They're only available for large farmers. Again, it's not the system, it's the rules in the system and ensuring that those rules reach those who need them most. We have 500 million smallholder farmers who produce 80% of the food in many countries across the globe.
Exactly.
And so recognizing that we need to provide them with the tools for success beyond subsistence. I am not about keeping any farmer in the situation where they are a subsistence farmer, because that's the challenge that you just talked about. Too often when I was at WFP, we were feeding the farmers who sold their food at the beginning, at the start of the harvest season, but by the end, before the planting season, before the rains came, we were feeding them, because they had no access to the capital that was necessary for their survival throughout the entire year. And so keeping farmers in subsistence, not providing them with the tools that are necessary for them to increase their harvest, store their food, access markets, provide for them to be a functioning member of the food system, is not the way forward to either support a food system that is more productive or farmers who are the lifeblood of that system.
I should just tell all the participants and the people watching YouTube, this is the issue actually where exactly Ertharin Cousin and I are thinking this through. And I think what's so fascinating is that I agree so much with and the kind of the farmers that I work with and coalitions I work with on almost everything that you've laid out, except for this. And this is where I want to kind of get at it, because I think we're at the heart of the kind of crossroads of international ag policy. Let's take, for instance, coffee. And Starbucks, and we're all, sipping our tea or coffee or whatever it is right now. An extremely consolidated sector, much like meat, much like sugar, much like seeds. We all know this. A farmer who is a brilliant coffee farmer, and I think we both know this. We both know enough farmers in the world to know they're indigenous or African diaspora descent. They're brilliant farmers. They would love to make a living farming, but they're growing and they're doing brilliant work. And then the dominant market has them compete with their neighbor in this race to the bottom of prices. So it's the refrigeration is kind of like a Band-Aid, the kind of handout of insurance company or insurance is a little bit of a Band-Aid, but the broader wound is that the system actually has farmers compete with each other because the corporate buyers are so consolidated. They're the price makers and the farmers are the price takers. And so the kind of big conglomerate purchaser can pit the farmer in Bangladesh against the farmer, if it's coffee, obviously it's Guatemala, Ethiopia, and they have no other option but to kind of, provide at lower the cost of production. So I actually want to kind of think through with you. Is there a
But
way
Gary,
that
let me just tell you one thing. Let me just
Yes.
make, yeah, as you say, we agree on so many points. Here.
Yes.
I was agreeing with you right up to the point where you said that the buyers are the price makers.
Mhm.
Actually, the consumers are the price makers. And one of the things that we have learned is that consumers will not pay higher prices. And so what the buyers are reflecting is what they can sell to consumers. And so the challenge that we have is, how do we educate our consumer, each other as consumers, that we pay, our food has never been cheaper. And so you could have picked any commodity, and you chose coffee, which is a good one, because you see often coffee brands that are fair trade coffees that are at a higher price point that do not sell at the same pace and rate as coffees that are lower priced, that have all of the challenges in the system that you just talked about. And so I am not disagreeing with you. I think that we do need to ensure that we are driving more of that opportunity, that financial opportunity, back down to the farmers. But we as consumers have some responsibility here as well.
Yeah, I hear you. And it's definitely the case that consumer education is so important. And I feel like it's actually growing. I feel like there's a lot of people unpacking, these questions of supply chain and broader ag policy. But at the end of the day, these larger corporations, whether they're input suppliers or they're purchasers, at this point are driving up the cost of the inputs for farmers: fertilizer, seeds that have to be purchased each year, be it, either hybrid because they're biologically single season, or the new agrobiotech, which is through intellectual property, legally single season. So the farmers are incurring so much debt just to grow a crop, and then they sell it on the global market and the price is below the cost of production, and there's no regulatory framework to help the farmer because of the alleged kind of free market, let the market solve it. So I guess I'm curious your thoughts. There used to be, I study ag policy in the US from the teens, 20s, 30s, 40s, 50s, 60s, there was elaborate government support for a fair price for farmers. So if I knew a farmer in the US, it was because there was the commodity title of the Farm Bill with the minimum price and supply management so that the price didn't collapse. It got gutted with the WTO, and that got kind of criminalized. And now it's this free for all, and the corporate kind of buyers and the input suppliers are doing very well, but farmers around the world are in this race to the bottom, in this treadmill of fancy inputs, and they can't make a living, and they're the hungry, and there's such a tragedy there. So I guess from your perspective, do you see players at the FAO or the World Food Program thinking about the kind of model that we're in, which is very neoliberalized, as undermining agrarian viability and thus food security or food justice?
And I think that we have had rounds at the WTO regarding the very issues that you've just articulated, that as a global community, we have not divined answers to. I think that whether you're talking the FAO, you're talking not so much WFP, but even the economists at the World Trade Organization, there you would have these conversations about what is necessary to increase the opportunity, the economic opportunity for all actors across the food system. And the challenge is, how do we develop the policies that will ensure that we not create a system that I want to say limits the opportunities for growth of farmers or other actors in the food system, but that also ensures that we address that challenge that they were fighting for in India, and that is a base price for their products. And that is the conversation that we as a global community have not yet engaged in a way that will provide answers that allow us to continue to grow an agricultural system that can feed 9.5 billion people by 2050, but also ensures the economic viability of all actors in the food system, including farmers. These are the tough conversations that we are going to need to have, not just sharp elbows where I stand on my position and you stand on yours, because our failure to communicate beyond the labels has limited both our ability as advocates in the system and definitely as governments in a conversation that is productive for anyone, particularly for smallholder farmers.
Yes. Ertharin Cousin, I love how you are framing this in terms of all people involved in the food system. And it really shows that you've been in this in all these aspects, because also food workers and farm workers is something else. I've had the honor of working with a lot of coalitions of farm workers, and I've learned so much. And farm workers are just farmers without land, as you know better than anyone else. And in the US context, which is different, but also reflective, many of the people who are food insecure, who cannot afford to feed, their families nourishing food, are working in food and working in fast food. Or who are working undocumented in fields. And so there's this labor exploitation on top of a broader, failure to get a fair price for farmers. And so I feel like at the end of the day, this question of accountability is not just at the level of the state. Regulation is so key and broader governance is key, but political economy, these companies, be it Walmart or McDonald's or anyone who's not paying the people who are doing the work on the front line enough for them to feed themselves. Where is the accountability? And I guess this got brought up with the UN Food Systems Summit last year. And if these corporate industries right now are so consolidated and have profited so much from the food system, but are not elected, where is the mechanism of accountability if the people working in those systems or growing food for them are not able to cover their costs and not able to feed their children?
So again, let's start with the Food Systems Summit and the conversation that was held and the voices at the table. There were 50,000 people at one point or another involved in what was ultimately the UN Food Systems Summit. And yes, it included private sector, including large businesses, because a solution, as you just outlined, will require action by multi-sector of players, not just government, but large businesses, whether we're talking consumer businesses or agribusinesses that have an impact on that food system. And so their participation at the table is critical to ensuring that we have outcomes that reflect the changes that are required for everyone across the system, whether you are eaters or workers. And so that is when you ask who is responsible, we're all responsible. We've talked about the role of consumers. You've outlined the role and responsibility of corporations to ensure that we are paying a living wage that allows a family to support their ability to feed themselves and their children, as well as to work at a counter to ring up a sale. And the challenge of a minimum wage, and even in this country, we know what we've gone through at the federal level, but we're now beginning to see action at the state level that is driving wages, minimum wage increases in different states across the country. We would all love to see one at the federal level, but let's move on. And then as corporations, there is a responsibility to ensure that we are providing the tools and the products and the innovation that is necessary, not just for affluent farmers, but for all farmers to maximize their ability to harvest the product that will provide for their family to have access to a living income. And that may require, and it was pointed out when they introduced me, that I sit on Bayer's board, that we are providing access to season tools for 100 million smallholder farmers so that they can have access to new innovations that are coming online. I will underscore again that we have a food system that today emits about 25% of all the greenhouse gases.
Exactly.
And it is the system that is most vulnerable to the climate crisis.
Exactly.
But when we talk about how we invest in the transformation of that food system to one that is environmentally supported, as well as supports our health and supports the economy of all actors, the dollars don't come to support that work. We had, as part of the Paris Accord, a commitment by the donor countries of $100 billion a year. That has not been met yet.
Yeah.
And no, all of that money will not go towards the food system, but I would argue at least 25% of it should go towards supporting investment in food systems transformation.
You heard it here first, people. I agree. Yes.
We agree on something. Yeah, I love it. I absolutely love it. But because the reality of it is, those most vulnerable farmers that you were talking about before, who are often hungry, also farm on some of the most vulnerable land on the entire globe. And so our inability to provide them with the innovative tools that are necessary to increase and ensure their ability to produce without expanding the land under agricultural production, because that's another entire conversation about the impact of our agriculture system on biodiversity.
Yes.
So we want to avoid expansion of the land for agricultural production, but making the land that we're working today more productive for all. Yeah. And so all of these questions require that everyone is included. But that also requires, and I spoke to this often during the lead up to the UN Food System Summit, is that we respect and include Indigenous knowledge into the solutions that we move forward, because all of the answers aren't over there. Some of them are right where people are working today. We just need to provide them with the support to scale those answers up. And so it's a combination of that work, which requires having Indigenous people, governments, as well as private sector, working together to achieve the solutions that are necessary.
So much. I love how it all is so integrated, the climate and the Indigenous rights and knowledge. Agroecology is a term that is encompassing the diversity of agricultural systems that have ancient roots, but current scientific justification for being ecologically resilient, for cutting and emitting and even sequestering carbon. So reversing climate emissions and greenhouse gas emissions, as well as providing the genetic diversity of resilience and the cultural diversity and highly nutritious foods. So these agroecological systems, again, are global. They're, in Thailand, they're in Peru, they're in Mexico, they're in Zimbabwe, and it's a broad umbrella term, as you know more than anyone here, that encompasses the Indigenous and the African diaspora, and oftentimes the female-led or gender diverse-led agrarian systems that have been devalued over the past century as folk knowledge, but in fact now the scientists realize are the future of agriculture in terms of resilience and nutrition and kind of food justice and food sovereignty. But there's this tension because the funding goes to agrobiotechnology and not to agroecology. So at the US level, at the FAO level, and even, in kind of broader research institutions, called Consultative Group for International Agricultural Research, people might take pictures of agrobiodiversity and hang them on the wall, but where the resources are moving to is often to the laboratory to create varieties and seed varieties that are oftentimes way too expensive for farmers around the world, and oftentimes are not, more often than not, ecologically adaptive to the kind of micro ecosystems. So why wouldn't there be more investment in agroecology if there's this consensus that this is such an exciting array of ecologically resilient and nutritious food systems?
Well, and again, I agree with you that agroecological answers and systems are part of the solution. But the reality is that we need a mixture of the two. We need innovative seeds that support that are also grown using methodologies from agroecological knowledge that has been gained. The agroforestry will require us to grow new seed varietals in forests that allow for increased production and oftentimes less water and less inputs. The challenge that we have with pure agroecology is the amount of yields. We are required to feed 9.5 billion people. And using a blended response is much more likely to address the food security needs of this growing population than a pure agroecological solution. And I am not suggesting that one over the other. I'm saying both and. Both and. We can't continue to have the kind of commercial agricultural system that has brought us to our present day situation. I don't know anyone who's arguing for us moving in that direction, but we also can't embrace only an agroecological solution as what is necessary for us as we move forward. Because we know that we have a population that is going to require us to provide enough nutritious food to meet all of the food security needs of that population. We have 3 billion people right now, as we're sitting here, who can't afford a diverse diet. And so I am all about identifying the solutions that include the best of both worlds, of all solutions, to help us drive forward towards a system that will meet our needs today, support our needs for a growing population, and protect our environment in a way that our grandchildren can also have access to the food that they need. And so all the data and all of the conversations that I have participated in regarding agroecology won't get us there. Won't get us there. So I'm saying we need the best of both and then some.
This is the set of questions. So I love that people are in the audience, and feel free to ask questions of the audience. I think there's a few there that we can look at. This question of amount and yield, though, is so complicated because there's technically enough food and calories being produced in the world, but it's such a matter of access, and so much of the kind of
I gotta stop you. That is the statement that makes me insane. When we say there is enough food, there is not, and the FAO is working on a study right now, the diverse calories that are necessary to support a healthy diet, we don't grow enough.
Agreed. No, agreed. The current production is commodity crops, which are oftentimes going to flex fuel, or to livestock feed. So the current production is entirely too geared toward commodity crop, monocultural, non-nutritious foods. So we're completely in agreement that there needs to be a shift to a more nutrient dense food system. The question is, can large monocultural production get us to that nutrient dense food system, which is so, kind of fascinating to think through, and also just it would take place differently in this continent and different than all these other continents. But this question of either agrobiotech or either agrobiotech or either agroecology is simplistic. It's a much deeper question than that. But the monocultural mode of export-oriented production has historically been non-nutritious. And so I guess the question is moving in the direction of more high input or high capital or high, input intensive seed production and monocultural export oriented. Is there any way that could ever produce nutrient dense food systems in an agroecological resilient way that actually
But who's arguing for maintaining a monoculture monocrop system? I think that what you will hear from smart agribusiness executives, as well as advocates for nutritious food, access to nutritious food, is we need a agricultural system that provides for more diverse production of foods, not just commodity foods, commodity crops. And so the challenge that we have as again, back to consumers and taxpayers, is where the subsidies. We have $700 billion in food subsidies that support the present cropping system. That's globally, that supports the present cropping system. We still in the United States consider the produce a specialty crop. And so it doesn't receive the agricultural subsidy support that commodity crops receive. How do we change those types of misplacement of investments to ensure that we are increasing crop production in a manner that addresses the challenge that you've just described?
There's so much, we need another hour. So many great points here. I just realized the questions are so good. So if I can just quickly, thank you, Ertharin, for thinking this through. And it's so valuable. We have to have you back regularly to keep thinking through this.
Can you tell I spend a lot of time on these things?
Me too. I love it. And Johanna, feel free to show your video, get back in the game here. We need you in this as well. But Clarissa asks about land permits and this question of land, tenure, and she's talking about food deserts, often called food apartheids, kind of repoliticizing. So questions of urban food production, and kind of moving past a neoliberal model. Ala Wunmi asks for questions about gender. There's so many good questions here. And then questions of emissions, which you brought up, thank goodness, this important, a third I've heard of agriculture, of emissions come from agriculture. And then questions about, Bayer Monsanto as just being this, very powerful player, and a lot of frustration, but, you're bringing up these other issues of maybe there's transformation happening within these political economies, but should there be antitrust concurrently just to kind of decentralize the power? And then Matt asks so many good questions. Maybe I'll just, if you wanted to look at any of them, or we need way more time.
Okay, first of all, let me just say I'm really excited about yet a new position that I've taken on that I didn't talk about at the top. I am now a commissioner on the Racial Equity Commission for USDA. As you know, there's this challenge of the USDA and how Black and brown farmers and women farmers, and now we're seeing challenges with the LGBTQ farmers and their access to the programs, the dollars, and the support that is necessary to participate in the food system. And so the USDA has just stood up an equity commission to talk about not just the challenges of the past, but as we develop these new programs for the future, whether they are urban agriculture, regional and local processing, livestock processing, how do we ensure equitable access to the financial as well as capacity building resources here in our own country to support a food system that is more just. And so I was thrilled when I was chosen as one of the 15 commissioners to take all of the information from both the public as well as inside the institutions and help begin to develop recommendations that we hope will affect the next farm bill as well as the ongoing operations of our own USDA. But on a global basis, we need this same type of policy support to ensure that as countries are developing their policies, many of the things that the issues that we've spoken about here today become central to how countries develop agricultural policies that provide for a just food system. And that is not, that when you begin to talk about the rights of farmers and the rights of farm workers, the rights of consumers to accessing food, this is all the conversation that we as a community of actors have a responsibility to ensure that we're engaging in, and not from our own lenses, but from a broader lens of making the change that's required for everyone and not just our own particular interest groups.
So there was also a question about, I'm talking about agrarian viability because I've had the honor of working with La Via Campesina, which is the Food Sovereignty International Network, and in the counter mobilization to the UN Food System Summit. And so the website is disparitytoparity.org. And so this thinking through food sovereignty and farm justice and agrarian viability internationally with the Indian Farmer Revolution solidarity and domestically is so key for questions of authentic food justice and food access. And so the question of, working with Bayer Monsanto is very complicated, but also I'm so glad to be thinking this out. So I think Kate and a few of the people on the School of National Service and Johanna are bringing us from various perspectives together to think this through. So I wanted just to kind of give a shout out for people. Please have this be more respect for SIS that I'm taking this platform to think through food sovereignty and food justice. But there's many other questions here. But I just wanted to think through with Johanna and with Ertharin Cousin at the very end to think through these movements for agrarian viability and for food sovereignty and agroecology are so powerful and yet so unsupported, from the broader institutions. So how can they be recognized in these halls of power for their huge potential and authentic food security and food sovereignty and food justice?
I wanted to go back to summarize the points because your question, Garrett, is such an important one, and we have to have another session about this because we're going to get done in the time we have. But I think there is a movement, not only in food, but everywhere in governance, that the communities are solving the problems. And they're not waiting for their governments to come in and make the change, because often the governments are incapable, or they're authoritarian, or they don't exist. And so it goes back to the point of educating consumers. The communities are the consumers, and they have much more power than they think they have if we can get the right tools to them. Because the food system is not one system. I mean, we may have a global supply chain system, and we may have the problem that food waste, if we were a country, would be the third largest carbon emitter in the world. But we still have communities that are working, even in places like the Central African Republic or in Haiti. And I think teaching about those communities and how to access what we have, I think, is a responsibility of the private sector. It's a responsibility of global systems. And I do think we're going to get an opportunity as we rethink multilateralism in the wake, hopefully, of this war in Ukraine, which has a ceasefire, to begin to include some of the points that all of you raised, that food sovereignty is more than just a right to food. It has to do with supporting the producers, supporting the consumers, and everybody else. And I'm sure, Ertharin, you would share that in your multiple roles.
I wholeheartedly agree with what you've said. That, but you're right. Movements are powerful. I sit here as someone who is the product of movements throughout our own nation, our own country. And so the reality is there is not a large business in the food system today that does not have a sustainability committee at their board level, does not have a sustainability officer inside their organizations. And that is because of the movements that are taking place, the demands that consumers, governments, as well as actors in the food system are demanding of of everyone involved in the food system. And so I'm pleased that companies know that they will, if they bring me in, they're going to hear much of what I'm saying to you today, that it is not about doing things the way we've always done them. And it is about recognizing the rights of all of the stakeholders in the food system, and providing the support that is necessary for everyone to benefit, as well as for us to ensure that we are addressing the environmental challenges that many agribusinesses have created in our world today. But there's also recognition of the opportunity that those same agribusinesses have provided. We don't have large scale famines anymore, except in conflict. Now that's an entirely different conversation that we can have, because we are growing more food today. And that would not have happened but for how we changed our food system. But did we do it all right? No. So let's fix it.
We definitely have to have another discussion about so many of the famines of the past are so political. It's actually colonialism, and not a matter of lack of production, but a matter of outright capture of arable land. Everything from Ethiopia, to Irish potato famine. Nearby, there was huge production. It was just going toward the British Empire, or toward the colonial empires. So this question of famine is so political, and it's such a question of equity and access. And even the Green Revolution, the overall stats show increase of food and decrease of famine, but they exclude China, which of course was getting out of the Great Famine over that same 40s to 50s time period. So it's actually skewed data, showing that it alleviated hunger because the Green Revolution wasn't part of China at the time. And so I feel like Raj Patel wrote a great essay, The Long Green Revolution, about kind of the geopolitics of the Green Revolution and the need to really understand what was going on and unpack the data that gets used to justify it, because there's a lot of problematic parts to it.
I'm not going to suggest that there are not problematic parts to it, but I think that we're better for it than we have if we had not had a green revolution. Right. But, and that but is the conversation we'll save for another day.
Yes. And I'd like another comment, because it relates to what both of you said. Food today is being weaponized. It's always been used as a weapon against civilians. And that is very different than, just colonialism. When you weaponize food, whether it's Ethiopia or whether it's Yemen or whether it's Syria or now in Ukraine, I'm sure there'll be a blockade. This is another question that we have to deal with at a multilateral level.
So true.
And that again was a conversation that we could have for about the next 30 minutes.
That's right. So I think
but I look forward to it, because these are the questions that require people, not just at the academic level, but policy leaders, activists, consumers, voters, to participate in conversations just like this one, to understand what are the real underlying problems that we must address in order to ensure access to nutritious food for everyone.
Mm-hmm.
I have a few other websites, viacampesina.org, disparitytoparity.org, and foodsystems4thepeople.org, but very important conversation. Thank you so much for sharing your time, Ertharin Cousin. We will definitely need to keep unpacking and interrogating these crucial questions. So thank you. And thank you for all of the questions were so good. So thank you for everyone who asked them. And I've tried to answer a few, but feel free, we can jump in, but I think we might be over time.
We are, unfortunately, and I appreciate this opportunity. Thank you.
Thank you.